Hello, everybody. My name is Sequoia Riley. I am a PhD candidate at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at University of Hawaii at Manoa campus. My committee chair and advisor is Dr. Carl Kim. So just to give you guys a little bit of background about myself, I am originally from Maryland. I was born and raised in Maryland, and I went to South Carolina, Coastal Carolina University, getting my bachelor's in marine science with a minor in applied mathematics. My master's was in marine resource management, still under the marine science realm, over at Texas A&M University, Galveston campus. And then I worked over at the Water Institute in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, before deciding to go for my PhD here at the University of Hawaii. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce you guys to what my research is in. It's on assessing barriers to green infrastructure for flood mitigation, a mixed methods approach. So just to give you guys just an overview of what the presentation will be covering is, I will be discussing with you guys about what green infrastructure is, give you a definition of what my research is all about, looking into the barriers of green infrastructure, along with looking at my research design and my initial findings and how all of it's related to transportation and urban planning. Okay, so what is green infrastructure? So there's many different definitions of what green infrastructure is. There are many papers out there that give different definitions of it, but for my research in particular, it is a multi-spatial, nature-based design approach. And the reason being is because it provides multiple long-term benefits, on the environmental side, economic side, and social side. And it's also very adaptable because you can place it in many different places within an urban setting, in a rural setting. Not to mention, you can also extend its life cycle based on the production of future flood events. So there are many green infrastructure tools that I've looked at, and these really stood out to me in particular, where you have vetiver, that is a particular grass that originates from India. And what's really special about this plant is that it can actually control erosion on hillsides, and it can also mitigate flooding on roadsides as well. Bioswales, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. You're still using some plants and putting in trapezoidal type of construction on roadways, or really on roads that, again, help to direct flood runoff away from development and also away from roadsides, so people can actually transfer themselves and transport easily. And then you have green roofs and blue roofs. While that's not really related to transportation in particular, it still can help as far as controlling runoff. And same thing goes for permeable and porous pavements as well. And all these really, on a scale or unit, you can see that, it goes from micro scale to macro scale. So the whole point of this is, there's not much investment going on with green infrastructure. I mean, there's some, but there's not a lot, particularly within the United States. And so, I wanted to look at what those barriers are that's preventing more investment, or even really any investment into green infrastructure. And then also look at what are the important plan quality metrics when designing and implementing a strategic green infrastructure spatial plan as well, all to ensure that there is social and environmental justice and equity, because there's not a lot of distribution with existing green infrastructure projects right now that is equitably distributed. So the reason being, I'm looking into this because it's all related to urban planning. Friedman said that planning is knowledge, and you need to get that knowledge to become an action. And the thing is, there's so much change going on with urban planning theory and land use that you can see with the flood events that are happening right now, or even like the past 5 years or 10 years. It's damaging roadways and it's blocking road and highway routes as well from people to escape and get away from any flooding that comes about their way. So with all of this change, there has to be some sort of action that has to take place, and that action is green infrastructure. But we need to reduce those barriers first. The physical landscape one, bring in many disciplinary experts from engineering to policymakers. We also need to bring together government institutions from different levels, from federal to local level, and also having green infrastructure become more familiar and amongst people who live in different settings, be it urban or rural. And then also with economic, make sure we get that funding, because there's really not that much funding as of right now. So to go into a little bit more detail about the barriers, there's a lot of patterns of land consumption that's going on that has caused historical dynamics and legacies between government and local communities, particularly with gray infrastructure such as culverts, roads that are made out of concrete, pipelines, and all that is really due to path dependency, because they are so dependent on gray infrastructure. That is what's causing them to not really pay that much attention to green infrastructure. And it's not just that they don't want to, it's because there's inadequate data on the value of its ecosystem services, technical knowledge, training, and like I said before, funding. So what I'm proposing for my research is to do a comparative study of all these plans that you see listed here. And what I'm looking for is, what are the green infrastructure tools and systems that they've already implemented or put in place or have illustrated in their plans? Was there any implementation? If so, what were the strategies, funding, mandates, and incentives? And if they had integrated any environmental and social justice goals. So how that connects back to the key research questions is, the whole point of me doing the comparative study is to see what plan components and metrics are missing. And by determining and finding what those are, that gives me an idea in determining what plan quality components and metrics are needed to put together a strategic green infrastructure spatial plan. And by doing that, the first thing I need to do is develop an appropriate framework and guidance that addresses flooding with green infrastructure solutions. And so within the framework and the guidance, I am looking at these metrics here with engineering, community, and planning. So with the engineering, it's very data rich, as you can see. There's a lot of data that needs to be collected and the different methods and tools that are needed. One that really stands out with data that's needed is looking at, the current flood events, census data, knowing what the optimal green infrastructure tools are and how to map them out based on suitability analysis and benefits and costs. And some of the methods and tools that will be needed for the ones that I've mentioned is HEC-ROS, ArcGIS, NOAA Digital Coast Flood Exposure Map, SOVI method, MCDA, and WLC, all suitability methods, and also consulting with NDPTC's engineering consultant. And actually, I forgot to mention that I am a graduate research assistant with NDPTC, which stands for National Disaster Preparedness Training Center. And there's a particular research group that I work with who is focusing on following case studies that I will mention later in this presentation. So an example of the data that I mentioned is, in Waimanalo, Oahu, there was a 2018 flood event that happened. And what you're seeing is two maps that were created by the research team at NDPTC of the flood event itself and also the flood exposure. So the reason why I am looking at this is because, as you can tell on the right for the flood event, that clearly gray infrastructure didn't work. The pipelines, the ditches, none of that worked in regards to mitigating the flooding. And so by looking at that and also looking at the flood exposure, that tells me how big of an extent green infrastructure should be placed in this particular setting. It gives me an idea as to where the green infrastructure tools need to be placed. So with community, the metrics that need to be looked into is participation. How many people are participating, who's participating, and are we giving everybody that voice when it comes to participating and giving their ideas and knowledge of where they live. It's all about balancing state, county, and neighborhood perspectives, looking at the differences between federal, county, and community thoughts. And so all of that combined is really also will help measure the social and environmental justice metric. So data collection methods that have been used and will be continued to use for my dissertation research is hosting focus group meetings and also conducting survey interviews and questionnaires. So with planning, I am planning to do a collective watershed level analysis, and all that requires plan quality metrics such as authority to plan, goals, mitigation policies, implementation, participation. And what I am adding that I have not seen in the other plans that I've done my comparative study on is social environmental justice, because I really feel that that is really important. And so, with planning, you really got to look at place when it comes to your metrics. It's not just about goals. It's not just about mitigation policies and implementation monitoring. It's really about connecting everything together in order to reach that long-term connectivity to resilience. I mean, you see the picture here, you see people walking between development and nature, and it really comes down to having a sense of place. So the case studies that I'm looking at is Waimanalo, North Shore Kauai, and Alawai watershed. They've all recently experienced flood disasters. They are all on a different scale development, going from rural to urban. Waimanalo is rural. You go further up, Alawai in being urban. And there's very little mitigation planning as far as flood disasters go. And there's a huge emphasis with gray infrastructure. From the community workshops that I've attended with NDPC's research team for specifically Waimanalo and North Shore Kauai, there was nothing mentioned about green infrastructure. Everybody was more focused on gray infrastructure and cleaning the debris from those flood events that occurred. That's all they were focused on. So my preliminary findings was, from the comparative study of the different plans that I looked at, like I said before, green infrastructure was not mentioned hardly at all in any of the plans, be it hazard mitigation plans and all the other plans. There's also a lack of infrastructure maintenance. And that really comes down to, conflicts between agencies, both county, federal, and local. And there's also multiple land ownership too, which makes it also difficult as far as maintenance goes, because a lot of the pipelines and roadways and other gray infrastructure go through both public and private land. And so you can see that there's multiple barriers involved when it comes to implementing and adopting green infrastructure. And in addition, there is limited efforts as far as social and environmental justice goes and resilience and sustainability. So for more of my initial findings, there really needs to be adaptive governance process that needs to take place where you're involving citizens, you have multiple level governance, and you really need to ask the questions of who gets what, when, why, and how much. And then there's also a social and environmental justice gap where many different places in both urban and rural areas do not have a huge green space. And really, that comes down to environmental policies not really benefiting the wealthy elites and not so much minority communities or those of low socioeconomic status. So, my findings conclusions is that with green infrastructure, equitable distribution is essential because it comes down to a collective level approach where it's not just one particular household that needs saving from flood mitigation. It's an entire community that needs it. And that's why there needs to be an equitable distribution of it so that it can protect everybody. And there's also, green infrastructure also cannot reduce flood risk 100%. There are many root causes for these existing barriers. There is not a one size fits all approach, which is why I mentioned that I want to look more into using green infrastructure because it is something very innovative and special, really, when it comes to urban planning that has never really been looked into uh, for too much. And spatial planning is an innovative plan. Further research is, we need to, I want to show that there is different criteria needed for a diverse community where it's going to be different when it comes to putting together a green infrastructure spatial plan for both rural and urban areas. And also, I really do believe that there is additional attention to overcoming the political and institutional barriers.